Hi, everyone. Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, US. We're very honored to have Christian Lemaire, our research fellow for naval security, in from London today, and so we decided we would do this at the very last minute. We are also very happy to have with us Michael Mcdevitt, who is a senior fellow for strategic studies at CNA. Rear Admiral Michael Mcdevitt in over his 15 years at CNA has been both a vice president and is now a fellow. He has a number of papers dealing with security issues in Asia, and his most recent research focus has been on maritime security issues along the Indo-Pacific littoral and the maritime dimension of China's national strategy. We also have with us Eli Ratner. He's a fellow at the Center for New American Security. His research interests include U.S. national security strategy in Asia, China's foreign relations in the region, and the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. Dr. Ratner recently served in the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs at the State Department as the lead political officer covering China's external relations in Asia. He was an International Affairs Fellow sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations, and his portfolio included China's activities in and relations with North Korea, Japan, Burma, the South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Christian is going to take it from here and lead the program on Asian maritime disputes and U.S. rebalance. We'll do a program for about 30 minutes and then questions and answers. I hope you all enjoy it.
Thank you, Randy. I am 2 hours off a plane, so I will try and make as much sense as I possibly can, but I won't guarantee anything. The idea is for me to give a brief overview of Asia's maritime disputes and possible reasons for their current intensity. Eli will then talk about the US pivot, the so-called pivot or rebalance, reasons for it, future of it, and its relation to the maritime disputes. And Admiral Mcdevitt will be talking about anti-access area denial and the military aspects. And if there's anything left to say, I might give a quick wrap-up at the end. So just to frame the discussion today, it's clear that there are a variety of Asian maritime disputes that have become much more intense over recent years. The South China Sea and the East China Sea are probably the most infamous, but we can also look at the southern Kuril Islands and Dokdo Takshima as two other disputes that have increased in intensity of rhetoric, if not necessarily any military deployments over recent years. And so the question really is not just why the East China Sea and South China Sea are so intense, but also why these maritime disputes are simultaneously seeming to come to the boil. Obviously, a lot of analysts will point towards what they call the assertiveness of China. That is the increased diplomatic, military and political attempts by China to coerce or compel its neighbours to increase its influence over the various maritime disputes in its near abroad. Beijing would obviously disagree with this concept of assertiveness from the Chinese. They would consider it simply reactive to the activities of their neighbours. And therefore a great misunderstanding of what China's diplomatic goals has been. But I think we can certainly say with confidence that since certainly 2008, China has acted with much more confidence in its maritime diplomacy in its near abroad. So I think one of the reasons for the intensification of the Asian maritime disputes has certainly been the rise of China. It's created great uncertainty in its neighbours, and the opacity of decision-making in China only adds to that uncertainty and amplifies it. I'd also point out the fact that the sea is increasing in importance for all of the states in Asia as well. One aspect of this is the growing importance of trade routes and, by extension, choke points for the various nations in East Asia. Obviously, the Malacca dilemma of China is well known, but it's not just regional states that rely on trade through the region. About 50% of global maritime trade passes through the South China Sea, and about a third of it is US bound or going from the US as well. So there's plenty of extra regional interest in what happens in the sea as well. A second aspect of the importance of the sea is resources, both demand for and presence of resources within the sea. There's obviously a growing demand for energy and food amongst the rapidly growing economies of East Asia. More than 95% of many Northeast Asian countries' imported oil comes through the South China Sea or through the Strait of Malacca. And there's greater pressure for food sources from the rapid growing populations in East Asia as well. At the same time, there's a greater ability to exploit maritime resources, either through deep-sea drilling or through open ocean fishing as well, which makes it much more attractive for nations to try and exploit those maritime resources for their own benefit. If you're sitting in Beijing and you're worried about energy security or food security, you're looking at your oil imports that are coming from the Middle East, and you suddenly find there's a great bonanza of oil on your doorstep, it obviously makes a lot more sense to try and secure that resources closer to you. Combined with this rise of China and growing importance of the sea has been necessarily growth in naval and paramilitary forces within the region. It's not just China, although it's been most impressive in China. We've seen, for instance, maritime paramilitaries coalesce or grow in countries like Malaysia, where the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency was first introduced, and other governments in the region also pushing for a stronger naval and maritime paramilitary presence within the region. This has certainly increased the capabilities to coerce or compel others, or at least to launch operations to try and enforce de facto sovereignty. And at the same time, there are unclear intent towards the use of these increased capabilities. One further aspect that has been important, certainly in recent disputes, is the nationalism within East Asian countries. To some extent, in countries like Japan, we are seeing a shifting political debate that is allowing a resurgent nationalism and the idea of a normalized defense posture within the country. Obviously, there's a great nationalistic strain within countries such as China, Vietnam, and even the Philippines, pre-colonial, formerly colonial powers or countries that were affected by the colonial era that have a very antagonistic relationship to the idea of interference within their sovereign affairs. And that makes it a very emotional aspect as well as a strategic one when these Asian maritime disputes are more intense. It also means that public opinion is a driver to decision-making within these countries as well. It's an often unregarded fact that public opinion actually has quite a great influence on the unrepresentative governments of China and Vietnam, and that Beijing will certainly listen to public opinion and will try and guide public opinion where possible, but there is a danger of the tail wagging the dog if nationalism gets out of hand. And finally, and perhaps more esoterically, I'd point to a return to the sea for various East Asian countries as well. A number of countries, such as Vietnam, suffered great internal turmoil after the Second World War, and while these situations are by no means over in certain countries, they're certainly a lot more balanced than they used to be. And so with the situation on the land stabilising, countries can now turn their attention to the sea. Asia has always traditionally been a very maritime sphere, and so regaining that maritime focus is a perfectly natural thing to do. If we look at Hu Jintao's speech during the recent National People's Congress, for instance, where he talked about securing maritime rights and China becoming a maritime power, we can gauge the increasing interest in the maritime, even for countries that have traditionally been very continental, like China, in their outlook. This means that there's an increasing competition in the seas in Asia amongst those various countries in terms of resources, in terms of navies and paramilitaries, and in terms of diplomacy as well. And so the maritime disputes that exist, which are numerous and very long-running, have suddenly come to a much more intense period, despite places like the South China Sea, for instance, having seen a period of relative stability between 1995 and 2005, given increasing multilateral diplomacy. So with that frame of why the maritime disputes are so much more important and so much more intense now, I'm going to hand the floor over to Eli, who will talk about the US reaction to this intensity and what it means.
Great, thank you. I think that's in some ways a perfect lead-in to what I'm going to try to do, which is something that we could talk about for hours, but I'm trying to do it in 10 minutes so we can get to the conversation. I'm going to be talking about the rebalancing. That's the word the administration uses rather than pivot. Pivot has been problematic for various reasons. I personally don't mind the word that much, but I'm going to use rebalancing rather than pivot. I think just two things up front to sort of layer the context here. And I'll get into more details. I think the first is that the rebalancing is not a knee-jerk reaction to Chinese assertiveness, that this is a set of policies that came into force very early on in terms of thinking of the Obama administration, which came in trying to reassess the strategic priorities and the interests of the United States looking forward, thinking about the end of the war in Iraq and looking toward an end to the conflict in Afghanistan as well, and thinking about where was the United States potentially overweighted or potentially underweighted in terms of its economic, diplomatic, and military investment in the world. So the idea that the United States needed to invest more in Asia and rebalance toward Asia came out of a much broader reassessment of U.S. foreign policy, rather than it being, again, sort of a reactionary set of policies to these maritime disputes. And I would also make the point that I don't think, and I'm glad Christian offered what I thought was a really sophisticated explanation of the sets of forces in action here, that many people say that the rebalancing is actually the cause of the intensification of these disputes, and I would argue that that's probably not the case as well. That being said, U.S. strategy in Asia certainly interacts with these crises and disputes in really important ways, so it is absolutely an important context, and it's a necessary element when you're discussing them today. Let me just offer very quickly what the rebalancing is. I would argue there are 6 lines of approach, and I'll just rattle through these quickly and then talk about what changes we are likely to see or not see moving forward. The first would be strengthening alliances with treaty partners in the region: Japan, ROK, Thailand, Australia, and Philippines. The second, deepening relations with emerging countries: India, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and China, which is absolutely included in the category within the rebalancing effort of countries with which the United States hopes to deepen relations. Third, doing a better job of engaging regional institutions, APEC, ASEAN, and ASEAN-centered institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit. Fourth, focusing on trade and investment in the region, particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, but also supporting the development of business ties and relations and investment with the region. Fifth, revising U.S. military force posture in the region to become more robust, flexible, and broadly distributed, and Mike may have a few words to say about that. And sixth, supporting democracy and development in the region, particularly the Lower Mekong Initiative, and also the Asia-Pacific Strategic Engagement Initiative, which was an umbrella initiative that bringing together a lot of disparate programs that Secretary Clinton announced this past year in Cambodia. So those are the multifaceted features of this effort, and it's important that we keep in mind, again, that it's a sort of a whole of government approach rather than just being a military or security approach, which, as it is often portrayed in the military, or sorry, in the media or in commentaries in the region. In terms of next steps, let me just rattle through what I would say are 5 features of the rebalancing strategy as it moves forward that all in one way or another relate to maritime disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. The first would be the White House has clearly been communicating a message of continuity. There were voices in the region again and elsewhere who were expressing concern that the rebalancing strategy was somehow a strategy of Hillary Clinton or Assistant Secretary Campbell, and with both of their expected departure at the end of this year or early next year, there were concerns by both potential, or there were concerns as well as perhaps encouraging signs by some in the region that the United States may decrease the rebalancing effort broadly and its focus on the region. I think the White House has been communicating very clearly that this is not the case, that this is a White House-driven effort, that it's a President Obama effort. We saw National Security Advisor Donilon give an important speech at CSIS before his departure to the region, to the EAS summit, as well as the President's first trip after re-election to the region. I think those were important messages that this was going to be sustained into the second term and was not the result of any particular constellation of U.S. government officials. On top of that, just in terms of the notion of continuity, I think it's important to note that as much criticism as the interagency process gets in the U.S. government, this is an example where there's currently very regular and strong interagency coordination on the rebalancing effort broadly and on some of these disputes as well. That there's between the White House and the Pentagon, the State Department, there's very regular meetings, very positive coordination, and what many describe as consolidated messaging with clear statements of strategic purpose. The words are chosen carefully. It's not as if various arms of the U.S. government are out sort of haphazardly asserting their own departmental interests. There's a whole of government, U.S. government effort. The second point that I would make in terms of the, moving forward and would be on the military, and there's a lot to say here, and I'm going to leave most of it to Mike. Let me just make a couple points that have to do maybe more with policy than big military modernization efforts. The first being, I think we're likely to see perhaps more visible presence by the United States in terms of freedom of navigation operations and exercises. Not necessarily more of these per se, but at least being clear and sending messages of reassurance about the U.S. presence in the region. And the second would be related to some of the issues that Christian raised, but continued focus on building partner capacity, particularly in the maritime domain awareness, and also in other maritime areas of maritime capabilities, such as Coast Guard capabilities, paramilitary perhaps, that are relevant to maintaining peace and security and stability, particularly in terms of these maritime disputes. The third issue I'd raise would be, again, the message of that the United States and the Obama administration is looking to put forward a multifaceted policy to deal with maritime disputes. That this isn't just a military issue with military solutions, and there's going to be an emphasis on the non-security elements that the United States can bring to bear to counter the misperception of the over-securitization of U.S. policy. So I would look toward increased role for diplomacy, an increased role for economics, an increased role for institutions and international law, all looking for non-military means to deal with these maritime disputes. I would look in particular to the speech that Secretary Clinton gave on economic statecraft in Singapore on November 17th. I think that was an important message about the prioritization that the administration is putting on economic tools of statecraft and using economic tools to deal with strategic issues. And also, of course, the administration is going to be looking to build cooperation on non-traditional security areas like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and other issues that are separate from high-end security issues that are being evoked by some of these disputes. The fourth area I would raise in terms of moving forward would be on greater focus on the sustainability of the rebalancing effort within the U.S. government. And this relates to the much more mundane, some would say, aspects of government related to the budgeting process, related to the interagency process, personnel decisions about how many Foreign Service officers you have dedicated to this issue versus that issue. I think there's a real sense within the government and without that if the United States is serious about rebalancing to Asia, that has to be reflected in the institutions of the U.S. government from top to bottom in terms of process, not in terms of just high-level strategies. I think, again, in terms of these disputes and otherwise, we're likely to see U.S. government institutions be redesigned and reformed to be more focused on Asia. The last point I'll make in terms of where the policy goes from here, and in my view, probably the single biggest question for U.S. strategy, is how the United States can effectively reconcile rebalancing and engaging more deeply in the region while maintaining stable relations with China. And I think this is a huge question. We can get to it certainly in discussion, and again, Mike's remarks will certainly relate to this in terms of the military aspect. But I'll just say briefly, anyone who has been to China recently or interfaced with Chinese interlocutors will have been told that the rebalancing effort is designed to contain China. I think this view is widely held within the Chinese government, it's widely held in academic circles, and it's widely reflected in public opinion surveys. Even those aren't always the most reliable. We have seen movement even among those when we look at surveys by Pew and others. Specifically with respect to the maritime disputes, I think that's really where these are highlighted and underscored the most, where Chinese activists, Chinese strategists argue that the United States is either actively fomenting conflict between China's neighbors, that it's trying to push countries into conflict, or a slightly more nuanced interpretation, which is that regional countries themselves, perhaps against the will of the United States, are feeling more emboldened to challenge China because of the enhanced U.S. presence in the region. In the cases of the disputes between China and the Philippines over Scarborough Reef and the recent dust-up with Japan over the Senkakus, in both of these instances, the Chinese have grabbed onto these instances where the United States is either the black hand motivating these, or at least the underlying factor, putting aside most of what I would argue are the more accurate drivers that Christian identified. In terms of responding to this narrative, and I'll just say a couple things. Again, we can get into this in much deeper detail. Clearly, the United States is not looking to maintain China. A policy to contain China, a policy of containment of China would look very different than the rebalancing and look very different from U.S. policy today. So I think that's a false accusation. And again, we can get into that into a lot more detail about the principle-based nature of U.S. policy in the region and the principle-based nature of the U.S. approach to these particular disputes, rather than taking sides, backing certain countries in a way that are provocative rather than de-escalatory. So I think the record over the last couple of years demonstrates that, and we can talk about it in more detail. The last thing I'll say is that even though I think the narrative of the United States trying to contain China or causing a deterioration of China's external security environment is wrong, it is something that we have to compensate for, because the consequences of it could be real if China responds to that in certain ways, even if we don't think that's an accurate assessment on their part. So it is something that the United States needs to take into account. And frankly, one of the messages that I always like to communicate to Chinese friends is that positive or stable relations with China are an absolute integral component of the rebalancing effort. In many ways, it's the key that unlocks the ability of the United States to engage broadly throughout the region. And if you look at many of those elements that I mentioned as the elements of the rebalancing strategy, whether it's engaging with treaty partners, deepening relations with emerging partners, engaging institutions, advancing a trade agenda, etc., all of those would suffer if the United States and China entered a highly competitive dynamic. So it's important to remember that from a strategic perspective, positive relations with China, China having a positive role in the region, and good, peaceful, and stable relations with its neighbors is an important component upon which the United States can build and advance its interest in Asia. And the notion that somehow the United States would benefit from fomenting conflict between China and its neighbors is foreign to me in terms of strategic logic. And because of that, I think the administration is going to look, as it has been, but perhaps with more intensity and focus, on how to integrate China into the rebalancing effort, whether that means bringing China in to cooperative arrangements with other governments, as well as to really search for practical opportunities for U.S.-China cooperation. And I think some of the positive progress on U.S.-China mill-mill cooperation has been a product of that. And obviously the administration and hopefully the Chinese side would like to see that progress further into practical areas of cooperation. So let me stop there and be happy to expand on any of those topics further.
Thanks, Steve. I think it's very important to highlight the fact that the rebalance isn't just military; it's a multifaceted strategy, as you pointed out, and it still involves engagement with China. It's also important to point out it's not a containment strategy, but I think there's an interesting question about whether, although it's not containment, is there an element of deterrence in the military aspect of it? And I think that's something that Mike could probably answer for you.
Oh, well, thank you. I'd like to thank Randy Bell for inviting me to make this presentation as a longtime IISS member. When IISS calls, I try to respond. Just one thing on the economic piece. When I talk about what's going on in Asia and what have you, I often remind everybody that all of the article that said most of the world's money is in Asia or going to Asia. And you can't forget that, because part of the rebalance strategy is about U.S. jobs. We want to sell things to rich Asians, things that we make here in the United States. So it really is a job issue too, seriously. And so the economic piece of that is very important. My way of characterizing the rebalance is it's best understood by attempting to restore the traditional balance to U.S. security policy, which has always had a strong aspect of Asia security since 1898, as a matter of fact. And it's also intended, quite frankly, to counter the narrative that was very strong in the region about America's decline in the face of China, and hence a key element of the rebalance is reassurance. Now, when you talk about the strategic context from a point of view of security issues, to me the most important thing is during the last 10 years of America's involvement in the wars in the Middle East, China has been moving to sea, to put it bluntly. The strategic balance in Asia is changing. Now, for half a century, that balance was rough. It was in balance. It was the continental powers and the maritime powers. Essentially, neither one had the ability to intrude in a militarily decisive way into the regime of the other. Well, that's changing. It started to change about 16 years ago, when China had the political motivation and the economic resources to begin to address which had been historic weakness, its vulnerability to military intervention from the sea. And the incentive at that time for Beijing was, of course, going on in Taiwan and the fear that Taiwan was moving toward de facto, de jure independence. And they, when faced with the problem, the PLA had really no alternative but to escalate to potential use of nuclear weapons because they had no other way to prevent that from happening, particularly if the U.S. intervened. So China's threat to militarily intervene was essentially a paper tiger in the term of art. And so that really provided the incentive to think more seriously about what do we do about intervention from the sea. And certainly historically, ever since the Opium Wars of 1842, China, the whole century of humiliation started with intervention from the sea. How did those foreigners came? They came from the sea. And so what China has been doing is essentially, historically, uniquely, expanding its defense perimeter hundreds of miles to sea. And the drivers, as I suggest, are Taiwan, the fact that the vast majority of the security issues that China has that are still unresolved are all maritime in nature. The reality that its economic Gold Coast, if you will, is on its eastern seaboard, uniquely vulnerable to attack from the sea. And perhaps, and also the fact that it depends upon the seas for its economic development, for imports and exports. And so it's what China has been about is essentially defensive. So you say, what's the big deal? Why should we be worried? It's a defensive concept that they're putting in place. The trouble is, for all of the countries that live in the shadow of China, what is happening is what the political scientists call is creating a security dilemma. In other words, as China's defenses improve, Japan's and South Korea's and Taiwan's and everybody else's gets worse. And so that also is a key part of what's going on there. So what is China actually doing? Well, to put it simply, they're knitting together a large submarine force, land-based aircraft that can launch anti-ship cruise missiles, and in the near future, if they're successful, ballistic missiles that can actually hit a moving ship. Now, all of these capabilities to work means that they have to be able to actually conduct reconnaissance or surveillance of the open ocean, to be able to find and locate ships so they can vector those submarines, so they can tell the airplanes where to go, so they can aim the ballistic missiles. If you don't have surveillance of the ocean, all of these other systems aren't going to be very effective. But they're building this surveillance network. So together, this combination of knitted together systems are what the U.S. has characterized as anti-axis or area denial, or in the Pentagon shorthand, A2AD. The Chinese, of course, have a term for it themselves. They call it counter-intervention operations. Very explicit. So, but no matter what you call it, the desired military outcome is the same: to keep U.S. naval and air forces as far away from China as possible. And so, the strategic implications of that for the administration, the U.S. government, is how credible a security guarantor are we to our treaty allies in the region? If for some reason that it may be far-fetched, if for some reason, though, they get in a dust-up with China and they expect the U.S. to ride to the rescue, they worry that maybe China can keep us from riding to the rescue. And so what is the U.S. doing about this? To prove to our friends and allies in the region that America's staying power, America's ability to act as a stabilizing force is actually credible. Well, the first thing started long before, not too long before, the Rebalance pivot strategy was announced. It was in the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, in which first announced the concept of the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force working together in something called air-sea battle. Now that's subsequently gotten lots and lots of publicity, And of course, China has become very concerned about that because they say, well, it's aimed at us. Well, yes, it's also, it's essentially aimed at any country that tries to put in place a capability to keep U.S. forces from approaching their shore. Iran also is putting together these A2AD capabilities. But certainly China is a major player in this. Now, most of the concept is highly classified for understandable reasons. If you're worried about defeating a system that's put in place, you're not going to tell everybody what you're doing. But recently there's been a couple of articles by the heads of the Navy and the head of the U.S. Air Force that essentially helps you understand air-sea battle. It has 3 lines of effort, what I call the 3 Ds. D as in Delta. Disrupting enemy surveillance systems, because surveillance, as I pointed out, is the backbone of any anti-access system. If the surveillance system doesn't work, if you can't find the targets, you can't shoot them. 2, destroying enemy launching systems, so precision weapons can't be launched. During the Cold War, this was characterized as, we'll shoot the archer instead of shooting at the arrows. Now this is the area that has caused the most consternation among people who have been looking at this, because it implies, I have no idea if it really is, but it implies that you would be conducting attacks on mainland China. So needless to say, with a nuclear-armed China, this is a very chancy proposition. Whether any administration would ever allow you to do that or not remains to be seen. But that's part of that's the second D. And the third D is defeat. Defeating enemy missiles by either shooting them down or decoying them away. So you have disrupt, destroy, and defeat. Those are the things that characterize or capture the notion of air-sea battle. Now that's a long term. That's a long term. What is the U.S. doing in the near term? Well, during his November, just about a year ago, a little over a year ago, trip to Asia, the President announced the creation of putting Marines into Australia, starting with a small group, 250 Marines, eventually over the next 5 or 6 years to grow to a full-fledged Marine Expeditionary Unit, or MU, of 2,500 Marines. Once we get to that point, if we get to that point, obviously there's going to be a need for more amphibious ships in the Pacific region so you can pick those Marines up and move them. Otherwise they're going to be marooned in Darwin, not be able to go anywhere. So there has to be the lift to move the Marines once you get them there. The second thing that was announced actually was announced earlier by Secretary Gates at last year's Shangri-La dialogue, was the fact that we're going to be home porting 4 Littoral combat ships. Dumb name. Think of them as frigates. 4 frigates in Singapore over the next, as these ships are commissioned and go. I think the first one's due to arrive next year. They'll be there in Singapore. And then we're improving our security relationship with Vietnam, and there was a lot of press just recently, the past couple of days. I think Kurt Campbell's was in the Philippines yesterday on a 2+2 meeting with the Filipinos, talking about increased U.S. presence, rotational presence in the Philippines. So all of these issues that are announced in the near term, you'll notice, focus on Southeast Asia, which has been a focal point of the administration since the beginning of the Obama administration. Improving our footprint, diplomatic footprint, as well as our security footprint in Southeast Asia. Also announced was a plan to increase the number of the U.S. Navy ships assigned to the Pacific Fleet to 60%. Well, that sounds impressive, but we need to look at the numbers. The U.S. Navy has a total of 287 warships. So those of you who are math challenged like me, I had to run the numbers. 60% of that would be about somewhere between 157, 158 ships. So if you take, the Navy wants to grow to, in this 60% of the fleet is supposed to be accomplished by 2020. The Navy hopes to have 290 ships by that time, or 300 ships in between that. So the delta, we're talking about at most an increase of roughly 20 ships over the next 5 or 6 years. So we're not talking about a massive reorientation of the U.S. Navy into the Pacific. And even if there was any surge capacity, remember, keeping carrier posture off of Iran, as long as the possibility that Iran might close the Straits of Hormuz and what have you, is also a demand signal for naval forces. So even if the administration wants to swing more to the Pacific on a temporary basis, it's going to have a hard time doing that as long as Iran remains an issue. So the important thing to keep in mind is what's happening is improving the capabilities on existing ships, not a huge increase in the number of ships. And that's why it's so very important that our friends and allies in the region who have strong navies, like Japan, like South Korea, and what have you, learn to operate together and learn to operate with the United States, improve our interoperability, because having competent, capable naval forces that can interoperate with the United States is going to be an important part of our rebalance strategy. So now, just to also, there wasn't much talk about what's happening with the Army and the Air Force. Recently, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, in a speech in New York said, first of all, we're not taking any more soldiers out of Korea, so the Army footprint in Asia is going to remain. And as surveillance assets are released from Afghanistan, they're going to be assigned to from the Air Force surveillance, the UAVs and U-2 reconnaissance aircraft are going to be assigned to the Pacific. There's going to be more rotations of bombers through northern Australia, and they're going. And as you may have recently seen, there was some announcements made about space surveillance systems that are going to be relocated to Australia, to northern Australia, and what have you. So, in total, that's essentially what the security hardware piece of the rebalance is all about. And so I think I'll stop there and leave some time for questions. But the important thing to keep in mind, I think, is it's going to be improving the capabilities of the systems we have, as opposed to a massive shift of new things or more things to the Asia Pacific. Now, caveat, unless things get very bad, and they aren't there today.
Thanks. I was just for 2 minutes, and I know we're running over time, and Brandy looks a bit nervous, but for 2 minutes I was going to point out what might be considered possible dangers of the military aspects of the rebalance as well, because we've just focused on that in A to AD. As Eli rightly pointed out, much of the rebalance is there to reassure allies, and as Mike was just pointing out, some of it is also, to some extent, to, if not deter China, certainly to suggest to China that the US presence is aimed at defeating its A to AD capabilities. But there is a concern that the specifics of the rebalance will actually offer more strategic space to China, because what we are seeing is not so much a rebalance to Asia, but a rebalance within Asia. Part of the posture the US is forming at the moment is a redistribution of 9,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam, Hawaii, and the Marines in Darwin that Mike just mentioned. So we're seeing a spread, a dispersal of US forces throughout Asia, which has the benefit of being able to engage with more allies throughout the region, but also has the ancillary effect of moving US forces further away from China. That's good in that they're now out of the missile range of some of China's missiles, but it may be bad because if you're sitting in Beijing, it suddenly looks like the US is actually withdrawing rather than bolstering its position in Asia. There's also the danger that the rebalance will be called to bluff by China. As Mike pointed out, ASBC would require the US to adopt a very escalatory, extremely aggressive posture in any conflict, which would involve strikes on the Chinese mainland, potentially deep within the Chinese mainland. And again, if I was sitting in Beijing, this may seem to be very much a deterrent bluff that could easily be called. There doesn't appear to be much appetite within the US administration, or even future US administrations, for that kind of escalation if something was to break out at sea and could easily be contained. On the other hand, there's also the danger that the US rebalance, specific as it is to China to some extent, is now introducing a bilateral military competition that didn't necessarily exist previously. It's obviously alarmist to draw comparisons to early 20th century Europe and the UK, Germany naval arms race that occurred there. But there are some similarities in the theoretical underpinnings behind this. Admiral von Tirpitz, who was the German admiral in the early 20th century, who encouraged a rapid build-up of the German fleet in what might be called the fleet in being strategy, was keen on constructing a fleet that was strong enough to effect as much damage as possible on the UK so that it would think twice about attacking. To some extent, China's A2AD capabilities are similar. They're not looking to defeat the US militarily and overturn its entire force, but simply to encourage the idea within the US that any attack would be too costly and therefore deter it. The US is responding by suggesting that they could easily defeat this A2A2 capabilities, and now suddenly there is this action-reaction in their relationship that didn't exist before. And finally, there is also the danger that the US will not be able to reassure its allies, despite the rebalance. Given the issues to do with austerity, and we're now very close to any potential fiscal cliff that might occur and defense sequestration as a result, there is considerable concern amongst Asian countries that the US, while it may have the rhetorical and diplomatic desires to remain very relevant in Asia, is decreasingly relevant for their security purposes. I'm not suggesting that's actually the case currently, but I've just returned from Tokyo, and certainly there are those in major US alliances that are concerned that the US alone is not enough to deter China in the medium term. So I think that gives us plenty to discuss, and I hope there'll be plenty of questions from the floor, so I'll hand back to Randy to moderate.
Thank you very much, Christian, Mike, and Eli. We'll move straight on to questions. I'm sure I have a question for Christian, but I'll make him answer it over dinner. We're running a bit behind, so I'll turn straight to you guys. Please state your name and affiliation, and make sure your question is actually a question. So please, Caitlin.
Caitlin Antrim.
We have a microphone coming for you.
Caitlin Antrim, Rule of Law Committee for the Ocean. China, in the past, has been a coastal state. It's looked at itself as a land power with limited coastal, limited interest beyond its coast. Now that it's investing in ports along the coast of Africa, it's depending on mineral supplies. It's now beginning to ship it through the Arctic to oil and gas in the northwest of Russia, and minerals from Norway, potentially from Canada. They're looking more and more like a maritime state. Their activities don't necessarily look like they think of themselves as a maritime state. Their actions in interfering with U.S. vessels in the exclusive economic zone could credibly be argued as a violation of the Law of the Sea Convention. It would help if we were party to the convention to make that argument. But it was also a violation of treaties governing safe navigation, so that they clearly were acting like a coastal state, even though their long-term interests are getting more and more similar to what ours have been, or even what Russia perceives its own as a blue water state. Do you see that changing, these outlooks in 5 years, 30 years? How do you think China will reconcile its distance interest in the sea with its history of looking only close?
I think what you suggest is likely to at least cause discussion inside Beijing, as they are more out and about, if you will, in a maritime sense. Some of the activities that we and many others find all the way from egregious to at least disturbing may fade away. But by the same token, China has this concept called legal warfare. I mean, it sounds hokey, but essentially what it is trying to reshape legal norms to accommodate Chinese interests, with the premise being we were not necessarily there at the creation, and all of these legal norms that we're being asked to comply with were put in place by the West, and we think if we can, we'd like to reshape them. So I think you have a competing dynamic. On the one hand, trying to say, well, I'll buy into some of it, but not all of the legal norms. On the other hand, as they become more maritime in character, they are going to find that many of the extant norms suit them very well. So we'll see how that dynamic plays out.
I would just add to that. I mean, I think in the long term, time will tell. But in the short term, the exigencies related to domestic nationalism and resources and domestic politics are so strong that arguments about, if there are folks making arguments like there probably are at the MFA and other Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other places saying, hey guys, we got to be careful here because when we move up to the Arctic, we're going to want Russia and others to play by a certain set of rules. I think given the demand signal, the severe and intense and immediate demand signal related to domestic economic and political issues, those arguments aren't going to win out until much further than we're at today.
I mean, I would just pick up on this debate between continentalism and the maritime focus within China, which I think is a fascinating one. And I think China has learned not only from its own Qing and Ming imperial history that its continental focus was very detrimental for its overall power, but also from European history where arguably France's failure to turn itself into a purely maritime state meant that it was eventually overtaken by the British Empire. And the fact that for the last 500 years the most powerful country in the world has always been predominantly a maritime state. So I think China is attempting to move towards a more maritime focus for exactly this reason, and Hu Jintao's speech was the latest indication. Yeah. But I also think that it has so many connections to the land, so many commitments to the land, and potential tensions, particularly with Russia and India, on land borders that in reality, it will always be dragged to some extent back to the land. And the UK was was necessarily a maritime state. The US had a relatively benign neighbourhood to allow it to extend itself to the sea. China, it's unclear whether that benign neighbourhood will exist on land to allow it to become purely a maritime state.
I'm Brian Percival. I'm with CNA.
I'm Brian Percival. I'm with CNA. Eli, I thought that was a very good talk. One of the things I want to ask about is where do we think Japan and India are going to play in this whole rebalancing process? They're one's supposedly a strategic partner, one's our close ally, but we seem to be very unsure of where we want them to play out of their particular regions. They have tensions of their own with China. Has the United States government thought this through yet, or how far do you think they've thought this through?
Well, I've been interested in Mike's comments on this as well, but I think in the case of India, the United States has made clear that we're interested in seeing India playing a larger role in East Asia. I think there's limits to cooperating with India in its own region, but there's hope that there may be more expansive opportunities getting out of India's littoral into East Asia. And India obviously has important routes to Burma and other countries and relationships with Japan and Australia and other countries that the United States would like to see strengthened. We've seen in the last year the launch of a official trilateral dialogue between India, Japan, and the United States, which is, to the extent the United States and the State Department are trying to put together these kind of constellations all the time. That's one that's actually moved forward. State Department officials have tried to do a similar India-China-U.S. strategic dialogue, and the Chinese have been unwilling to do that for reasons mostly related to Pakistan, but not only. So I think from a U.S. perspective, I think the notion of India playing a larger role in the region is seen as a huge positive, and it's just a matter of capacity constraints on the Indian side, and perhaps some willingness on the Indian side that might be limiting that. On Japan, it's an incredibly complex question. Obviously, I think getting back to my comments earlier, I think the United States has a very strong interest in seeing positive relations between Japan and China, and we're hoping to foster those now, and the types of disputes that are arising now and concerns about parties or politicians in Japan who might be interested in taking advantage of Japanese nationalism or taking advantage of some of these issues can be troubling to U.S. policymakers, because we'd like to see, I think that the message of late has been cooler heads need to prevail, certainly on the Chinese side, but on the Japanese side as well. In the broader sense, almost everything said about India applies to Japan as well, in terms of the United States seeking to foster, leverage its alliance and leverage its relations with Japan and Australia, Japan and India. Of course, we'd love to see greater cooperation between Japan and South Korea, as Mike mentioned, but there are political constraints on that currently. But Japan has played an important role in Southeast Asia, and especially in terms of economics and assistance historically, and I think we'd like to see that strengthened.
I would just say that in terms of India, I think it was the strategic document that came out a year ago that announced from the Department of Defense how it was thinking about the rebalance. Had the line in it that the U.S. looks forward to India being a net provider of security along the Indian Ocean littoral. I think we're, as Colin Powell once said, we're leaning forward in our too far forward in our skis right now with regard to India. Our ambitions for India to be more of a net provider of security, I think, outpace Indian willingness to lean that far forward right now. Not only because of worries about their own capacity to do so, but also there are still strong vestiges of the non-alignment ethos in part of the Indian decision-making elite. And so it shows up in our Navy relationship, which is quite good, but it has an artificial ceiling because the agreements that we normally sign on information sharing and what have you with sundry countries, India didn't want to sign. And so the problem that the U.S. is facing right now is India wants to be treated specially, different than anybody else. And so far we've had a hard time working our way through that. So I think our ambition for India outstrip theirs at this stage of the game. So in Japan, I think we've covered it. All I would say, when Mr. Abe wins the election here this weekend and takes over, if we listen, if he actually executes some of the things he said in terms of his campaign, we are going to be dealing with a much more assertive Japan, and that may make us a lot more uncomfortable.
Greg Tillman, Arms Control Association. Eli, you mentioned a whole of government approach or support for rebalancing. I think you were talking about the executive branch. The Senate, a third of the Senate plus change has basically blocked or delayed ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty after all these years. Isn't this a problem to doing the kind of things that the administration wants to do to support the legal norms that Admiral Mcdevitt mentioned, to be at the table when countries get together to try to resolve these prickly disputes under the Law of the Sea mechanisms that exist today, but without our participation? How is the Congress, and particularly the Republican Party in the Senate, going to be brought along in support of these policies?
That is a really good question. I think one of the features, I think, of U.S. Asia policy for a long time is that there's been bipartisan support. So I think broadly, while there are disagreements around the edges, and I think you've highlighted exactly some of them related to international law and institutions, in general, the rebalancing policy has not been subject to political food fights on Capitol Hill like we've seen on almost every other issue, foreign policy and otherwise. So in some ways it's a positive signal that it's been insulated from some of the partisanship. That being said, of course there's an important role for Congress. They're going to be controlling the money on this stuff too. So if you're talking about reprogramming assistance or reprogramming funds for the State Department, much less the Defense Department, and prioritizing Asia, it's going to require champions within Congress who understand the importance of Asia and understand Asian issues. And I think we're losing some key members right now, Jim Webb and others, who paid a lot of attention to these. And if you ask, who are the folks on the Hill who know a lot about Asia and are going to be pushing these forward, you don't have a whole long list. I think that's disconcerting and something we all and the administration and others and people in Congress need to work on. The question about the Law of the Sea gets very complicated because we're out there. In some ways, the United States adheres to the law, even though we aren't a member to it. So, to the degree that it would enhance our legitimacy, I think that's right. But I'm not sure the Republicans in Congress are going to hold back too far on the development of norms and rules. But I do agree it's a terrible signal when our own country isn't willing to sign up things we're pressuring others to adhere to. If you've got a fix for that, I'd love to see it. I mean, I think, as you mentioned, the disability resolution or what have you was, I think, most of Bob Dole and others on the floor trying to push it was a testament to how far some of the paranoia about blue helmets and otherwise are pervasive within. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. But I guess I would hope, particularly this is the commitment to the institutions that the administration has made. I think that's one area. Prior to the election, lots of folks were coming through my institution, and I'm sure all of yours, asking what's the future of the rebalancing, what happens if Romney wins, and my view is a lot of it has bipartisan support. Some of the areas you identified are exactly those that, like commitment to the multilateral institutions, where the Bush administration was good but not great. The Obama administration has been great, and the region is going to expect the United States to be great in terms of showing up and actively engaging in all these institutions. And I think that commitment will remain for the next 4 years. If we have a Republican president in 2016, I would hope he or she would continue that level of engagement. That'll be an area where there may be an ideological difference.
I would quickly, while we're not a party to the convention, we were present at the creation. We participated in all of the debates. We've actually signed it. We just haven't ratified it. And President Reagan directed that we follow it explicitly, and we are. So that does, and we have lots of really good international maritime lawyers. So that we ought not to be reticent about opining on what we perceive as violations of the law. We don't have to be have a ratified treaty to have an opinion on when things are when nations or activities are in violation of the agreed upon law.
I agree with that. I would say that I think the US loses moral standing vis-a-vis UNCLOS by its non-ratification of the law of the sea. And I think different states within UNCLOS have different interpretations of various articles. For instance, China would argue that its harassment of USNS vessels was actually legal under UNCLOS. Not many states would agree with it, but it's a reinterpretation of some of the articles of freedom of navigation, innocent passage, that the US can't really engage fully in the debate until it has actually ratified and fully and formally assumed all of the articles.
We had two questions right here, so why don't we take both of them?
Hi, I'm Caitlin Campbell. I'm with the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Thank you for your remarks. I'm wondering if we could talk about whether there's been an evolution in thought, whether it's here in the United States or in China or elsewhere, of the Malacca dilemma. It's sort of thrown around whenever we have these conversations, and it signifies, concerns about freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce to these choke points. But who's really, up late at night worried about a Malacca dilemma, and what does that look like? At what point, where do we meet that threshold where anyone's willing to, in like a conflict scenario, cause such a huge disruption? Or is that something that people are still concerned about? Or are we concerned more about sort of the quiet, ongoing creep in China's sea control and what that will mean for freedom of navigation? Are we really concerned about a disruption of commerce?
Hi, I'm Darrell Sung from the Singapore Embassy, and thank you very much for all your comments. I also wanted to note that in many of the allies and partners that the U.S. is working with on the rebalancing strategy, there's often a tension between a security establishment that welcomes a U.S. presence and an economic establishment and a business community that sees that doesn't want any tensions and sees China as their main engine for growth. And how does the U.S. work with its allies and partners in resolving different points of views on the relative merits of the American presence in the region, especially as parties change and new parties may come in that may be more pro-China, whereas rotated with other parties that are more pro-America.
So it's just past 6 o'clock, so why don't we use this as an opportunity to answer their questions and wrap this all up.
Okay. I'll kick off. There's only one person who has a Malacca dilemma, and they live in China. Right. And their dilemma, for them, they worry about oil making it from the Persian Gulf to China. And there's only one person who really has the ability to put their thumb on the wind pipe there at Malacca, and that's the United States. Now, India does as well, but not before you get to Malacca. So the important thing to keep in mind is the seas, all of the oceans of the world are seamless. It's possible to get shipping from the Persian Gulf to Northeast Asia without going anywhere near the Straits of Malacca or the South China Sea. It's a longer route around Australia and up through the Central Pacific, but you can do it. And so, and China is not only worrying about how do we make sure that if worst comes to worst, we have a conflict with the United States, we protect our sea lanes. But they're also looking at other alternatives, pipelines from central China to the south to the Indian Ocean and what have you. So quite frankly, there's been less talk about Malacca dilemmas per se, but anybody who's totally dependent upon their energy, much of their energy coming by sea, has to always have in the back of their mind, like the Japanese and the South Koreans, who are even more dependent than the Chinese, are that yes, those sea lanes could be interrupted. And for Japan, of course, it's not an abstract notion. That's what happened to them in 1944 and 45.
I mean, I certainly agree with that, and that's, I think, one of the interesting aspects of the deployment of LCS to Singapore is that it's a tacit threat of a distant blockade by the US on China. I mean, if we look at it from a cooperative angle, China's Malacca dilemma and to some extent the global Hormuz dilemma is a great way for the US and China to agree on the principles of freedom of navigation. No one wants these choke points closed down. We all rely on trade passing through them. The question is whether China is willing to accept the US's primary role as securer of those freedoms, or whether actually it wants to have a role to play, certainly in the choke points nearest to it, on which it's most dependent. And that's why it looks to create a bastion in the South China Sea where it has primacy, naval primacy, over the entire region, and it can secure its own routes through there as well. And the reaction to that by regional states and by the US as well is what creates this form of slight security dilemma that we are worried about in Asia generally. So, yeah, is there a Malacca dilemma? There is if you sit in Beijing. And Beijing's reaction to that and everyone else's reaction to Beijing's reaction is what is driving security concerns.
I'll take Daryl's question. He's probably heard me say some of this before, but I mean, I think this is the central dilemma for the rebalancing policy as to how to balance the reassurance deterrence side without fomenting engaging in security dilemmas or otherwise. How do you thread that needle? It's hard, but I think, you know, how are we going to do it? We're going to highlight non-security elements of rebalancing policy. We're trying to do that, obviously. On the maritime disputes, pursue as best we can a principle-based policy, trying to build regional order of rules and institutions, not backing certain countries and their narrow claims. Addressing issues of interest to the region and not to the United States. I mean, there was a narrative during the Bush administration that the U.S. was in Southeast Asia, for instance, solely for counterterrorism in ways that wasn't benefiting other aspects of the region. So dealing with quality of life, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, development, making U.S. forces and U.S. security assistance were down to the benefit of the average day life of the people there. And finally, staying engaged in an intensive and high-level way as we have been with Beijing, even if we're not always smiling and cooperative, staying engaged, and as I mentioned, trying to develop habits of cooperation with China so that countries feel that there isn't an outstanding U.S.-China competition and countries in the region don't feel like they have to choose between the United States and China. That would absolutely be the worst outcome for the United States and China in the region. So those are a few strategies. They're all really hard. Suggestions are welcome, but I think that's the challenge ahead.
I just asked for one point on that is U.S. policymakers are aware that every country in Asia is China's largest, or the largest trading partner of China. And they also understand that if you live in Asia, you know China is always going to be your neighbor. And the U.S. could go away, in theory, at the whim of a presidential decision. So I think everybody understands that sensitivity. I just wanted to make sure that nobody leaves the room with perhaps a mistaken impression. Christian said something about air-sea battle that I may have emphasized the wrong thing. I tried to emphasize that the surveillance system is the key to it. You do not have to bomb mainland China to deal with the surveillance system. So you ought not to think that air-sea battle cannot work or can only work by attacking China. There are ways to deal with surveillance system that has nothing to do with attacking China, and there are ways to defeat missiles through shooting them down or decoying them. So it's not as if the only alternative is attacking a nuclear weapons state.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Christian, Mike, and Eli, for a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for coming out to the ISS US today. I need to do a quick plug for our new book on this subject matter, Asia's Naval Expansion. It's $22 and it's available at the front desk on your way out. I hope you continue to come to the ISS US. We'll be doing a series of events on this subject and many others over the course of 2013. Happy New Year to all of you.